Hello and welcome to the Midwest Climate Summit's Climate Action Workshop, Planning for a Resilient Future. Today, Daniel Horton, Assistant Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences at Northwestern University, will be moderating today's multi-scale, multidisciplinary dialogue about how do you plan for a resilient future. Dan is a climate scientist, and he will give us an essential framework for understanding our region in that context. His expertise is in climate impacts and extremes, including the detection and attribution of recent climatic change and co-beneficial mitigation actions. Prior to Northwestern, Dan was a postdoc scholar in the School of Earth Sciences at Stanford University. He earned his doctorate in geological sciences at the University of Michigan and obtained a bachelor's degree in atmospheric science from Texas A&M and physics from Tulane University. Between his undergrad and graduate work, he served 5 years in the U.S. Air Force as an operational weather officer. Dan?
Thanks, Demetria, and good morning to all. Welcome. On what's turning out to be a relatively historic day. Who knew when we all signed up for this that we wouldn't have slept in the past 3 days? So thanks for taking time out of your schedules to join us to talk about this exciting topic. I'm excited to be here to discuss building climate resilience in the Midwest. I'm joined by a fabulous panel of experts, but I also wanted to acknowledge those of you tuning in from afar. I'm certain there's a lot of different perspectives and expertise out there, and I'd like to encourage you to share your thoughts and questions in the chat. At the end of the panelists' remarks, use your question to facilitate our conversation today. So please feel free to comment. So we're here today to talk about building climate resilience in the Midwest. And I thought it would be good to start off by defining climate resilience in some very simple terms. And these are my own terms, but I like to think that climate resilience is the ability of communities to weather the weather. And so there's two aspects of this definition that I'd like to highlight. The first is that the weather is changing. Anthropogenic climate change is often discussed from the perspective of global average changes, but I strongly believe that people will experience and come to recognize climate change via extreme events. Here in the Midwest, what this means is more frequent and/or more intense heat waves, precipitation, floods, droughts, and the cascading impacts that these events have on communities. And the second aspect of the definition I'd like to highlight is that the communities experiencing these extreme events have different vulnerabilities and capacities to absorb the stresses caused by climate impacts. By and large, the brunt of the impacts will be felt by the disadvantaged and communities of color. So today, we're here to discuss these ideas and how we might build resilience in Midwestern communities. As such, I'm delighted to introduce our first panelist, Barbara Cherry. Barbara leads the Nature Conservancy in Missouri's Floodplains and Nature-Based Solutions team, developing strategies and partnerships to benefit nature and help communities adapt to and increase resilience from flooding due to climate change. An experienced conservation leader with expertise in aquatic and terrestrial habitat connectivity and impacts of roads and development on wildlife habitat, Barbara moved to St. Louis from Maine to work for the Nature Conservancy in 2016. Barbara is currently convening a partnership of collaborating agencies implementing the large-scale Levee setback project in Atchison County, Missouri, a demonstration nature-based solution for flood resilience. Barbara, take it away.
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here, so just one moment. There we go. So as Daniel was telling us, flooding disasters are becoming more frequent and severe, and communities need more tools and solutions to reduce their risks. I'm going to talk about how nature-based solutions can help people adapt to the impacts from floods, benefiting both people and nature. and then share some tools and examples of projects that the Nature Conservancy in Missouri is working on. Helping people tackle the impacts of climate change is one of the Nature Conservancy's top priorities. So nature-based solutions have many benefits. In addition to helping reduce flooding and erosion, they improve water quality, increase wildlife habitat, and enhance recreation and protect infrastructure. Nature offers a powerful set of tools. Nature-based solutions use natural systems, they mimic natural processes, or they can work in tandem with traditional approaches, combining natural features with harder, what might be called gray infrastructure, to address flooding and erosion. And there are many different types of nature-based solutions. The Naturally Resilient Communities website, right here on the screen, is a great resource for learning more about them. And some include things like moving people out of floodplains and out of harm's way, restoring floodplains and wetlands to hold and slow down floodwaters, replacing road stream crossings with flood-friendly ones that restore habitat and protect public safety, protecting open space, as well as regulatory and policy approaches. Floodplain protection and restoration are key nature-based solutions to help address flooding. Research done by Chris Johnson at the Nature Conservancy and partners published in the Nature Sustainability Journal has found that across the United States, protecting floodplains to avoid damages in places where urban growth is projected can be a hugely cost-effective strategy. In this study, they mapped natural areas in the floodplain that are not in some kind of protected public land status, and if they get developed, are likely to incur future flood losses. They estimated the cost to acquire some of these lands using county level land value data, and then using an EPA data set, projected future development, and estimated the damages that would be incurred if development proceeded unchecked in these places and future flooding occurred. So long story short is this strategy would be cost effective for hundreds of thousands of square kilometers across the country. And even more striking, they identified an area the size of Massachusetts where $1 invested in protection today would save $5 or more in future avoided damages. And just to note, they did discount future damages to present to the present value to take into account probability that development and flooding happen decades in the future, and this was still cost effective. So to make this science and data more actionable, the Nature Conservancy developed an online decision tool to bring this and other floodplain information to decision makers. And that is the floodplain prioritization tool. And the purpose of this tool is to help users identify where they would get the most bang for the buck in the Mississippi River Basin for floodplain protection and restoration. So what you're seeing is a screenshot of the tool. The area in blue is the extent of the tool. So you can see it's most of the Mississippi River Basin, but not quite all. Prioritization can be done through this tool using criteria such as water quality, habitat, soils, impacts to people and property damages, and social vulnerability. You can go to fptool.org to learn more about it and to try out the tool. Another project is a floodplain management plan, and these plans are important for addressing flood risk. In the St. Louis region, flowing from the Missouri Ozarks, going north and then east and through the south part of St. Louis into the Mississippi River is the Meramec River. And it's one of the most biologically significant watersheds in the mid-continental United States. And the lower Meramec is highly flood prone with 3 record flood events in the last few years that included 10 days of interstate closure and thousands of homes and businesses flooded. The Army Corps led a partnership through their Silver Jackets program, bringing together 8 municipalities, 3 counties, and 7 state, federal, and NGO partners to develop a flood management plan that spans 115 river miles. So this large geographic scale makes it unique, as most flood management plans are done by a single community or small watershed. The plan was completed this spring with recommendations for each community to adopt and implement. And recommendations were all non-structural. They include buyouts to move people out of harm's way, flood proofing and elevation of structures, as well as possible changes to policies and ordinances in these jurisdictions, participation in FEMA's community rating system, and having this plan helps with one of the steps in that process, which helps discount their flood insurance rates. So that's a recommendation. And then also nature-based solutions. So to support the implementation of the flood management plan, I worked with local partners to develop a regional version of that same floodplain prioritization tool. This is where users can again identify places to invest in floodplain conservation or restoration based on their community priorities. And we took some regional data, incorporated that, and then zoomed in on the area of the flood management plan. And the tool also has all of the structures that were identified by the Army Corps study as being at high risk for flooding. So when you turn that layer on, you can click on each of these dots, which is represents one of the structures, and get the individual recommendation for that particular location. To learn more about this type of project, and this one in particular, you can go to the Army Corps St. Louis District website. If you just Google that and the Meramec, you can find out more information about the plan, and then also a link to the floodplain tool for the Meramec. On the other side of the state, in northwest Missouri, the Nature Conservancy is partnering with a local levee district. So the Army Corps and many other state and federal agencies have been working together on another powerful nature-based solution demonstration project, this large-scale levee setback. A levee setback is basically makes more room for the river by moving the levee structure away from the river and reconnecting more floodplain to the river. And as you all probably know, in 2019, the Missouri River flooded severely and damaged levee systems all up and down Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. And the Atchison County up in the northwest corner of Missouri levees were severely damaged. The technical term that's been thrown around is Swiss cheese. The flooding lasted for 280 days. In Atchison County, 56,000 acres were underwater, and hundreds of citizens had to evacuate. And what's unique about this project, this levee setback project, is it's led by the local levee board and includes private lands from willing landowners who've been severely impacted. The Atchison County Levee Board wanted to do something different for the future of their community and have been passionate leaders working with the Corps and other partners to accomplish this. The setback is currently under construction by the Army Corps and will reconnect over 1,000 acres of floodplain to the river. It'll reduce significant flood risks to the agricultural community and provide increased wildlife habitat. It's on the central flyway. This is a demonstration project of a nature-based solution, and that could be really replicated in many locations along the Missouri River and in the Mississippi River Basin. To learn more about it, we do have a website, and there is a video that tells a story about the project and a fact sheet. Just go ahead and go to nature.org, Mo River Levee. Another type of nature-based solution that we've been demonstrating is using nature to stabilize and restore streams to improve water quality and reduce erosion. Land use practices such as land clearing right up to the water's edge have greatly degraded streams, and increased flooding exacerbates these issues. This is an example from a small creek called Labark Creek just outside of St. Louis. It uses tree root wads, which are basically you take a tree and pull it out of the ground, cut it off about 20 feet, and use it at the base of a bank. These are highly engineered designs, so That's an important factor. You use these tree root wads to deflect the water, and then layer in fast-growing native shrubs and in this design. And so in these pictures, you can see the significant erosion that was occurring. This is an 8-foot high bank. And then the work in progress. And then about a year later, what looks like a natural stream, and it's providing high quality habitat for fish and other wildlife, and has increased the floodplain usability for the floodwaters. So traditional stream stabilization uses large quantities of rocks, which is often more expensive and does not really provide the habitat for fish and other aquatic wildlife. Nature Conservancy in Missouri, we're working with Missouri State Parks on another demonstration project at Castlewood State Park, just outside St. Louis, to restore Kiefer Creek. And this will be more of a hybrid approach. It'll incorporate rock due to it's a highly urbanized watershed, a lot of suburban housing and pavement. So the stream flows are significantly different. So this sort of urban hybrid approach we'll be able to demonstrate there. And we'll use that to inform engineers, contractors, other agency staff that would be doing these kinds of projects, and other decision makers in different jurisdictions about this multi-benefit solution. And in urban areas, nature-based solutions are also extremely important, and particularly for addressing stormwater. The Nature Conservancy in Missouri Cities program, led by my colleague Becca Weaver here in this picture, she's working with St. Louis community-led partnerships to co-create green stormwater infrastructure projects. And these nature-based solutions in our developed and developing areas provide many community benefits. They can be things like small rain gardens, or projects like this large underground cistern that's capturing all of the rainwater falling on Jubilee Community Church in North St. Louis. The rainwater is being used as irrigation for an urban garden, which is now on the site. You can see it in the area with the yellow box. That is where the urban garden is. And that's intended to provide food for the church community, be sold to local restaurants, and create local jobs. And that garden is really taking off now. Our goal at the Nature Conservancy is for communities to see nature as a commonplace solution and a tool in their toolbox to address their safety and infrastructure problems. Thank you very much.
Barbara, thank you very much. It's very exciting to learn about actual action on climate change and the implementation of solutions in the Midwest. So thank you for sharing that with us. Up next, I'm very happy to introduce John Eichard. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and PhD in agricultural economics at the University of Missouri. After finishing his education, he worked in an extension agricultural economics positions at North Carolina State University, then Oklahoma State University, and eventually became head of extension agricultural economics at the University of Georgia. In 1989, he returned to the University of Missouri under a cooperative agreement with the USDA to provide state and national leadership for research and education programs related to sustainable agriculture. John retired as a professor emeritus from the University of Missouri in 2000. And since then, he has written 6 books on sustainable agriculture and sustainable economics. John, take it away.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the program and be on this panel today. I looked up resilience in the Merriam-Webster dictionary to see what they had to say about it. And they define resilience as the ability to recover from or adjust to misfortune or change. When I think about resilience, I like to think in terms of 3 R's. Resist, the ability to resist, to recover, or readjust. To have resilience, it needs to be tough. You need to be able to bend without breaking to resist. But also, there'll be situations when you can't avoid harm, then you have to have the ability to recover from that, to bounce back, to have a plan B or redundancy that you can call upon. And then in times when you have kind of change in the overall environment in which you're operating, you have to have the ability to readjust or to adapt to that new environment. I think that's particularly relevant in what we're talking about today, because when we talk about climate change, we're talking about a fundamental change, not only in the volatility of weather, but a fundamental change in the overall environment that affects not just nature, the natural ecosystems, but also will have an impact on societies and economies. And it'll impact us as individuals, as businesses, and government. To kind of steal a line of the title from Naomi Klein, the best-selling author's book, when she was writing about climate change, she says this changes everything, and it certainly does. If we're going to survive on this planet as a human race, we have to plan for ecological, social, and economic resilience in our systems as we move forward into the future, those 3 R's. One of the most critical and important areas or systems where we have to adjust is in our food system, our agri-food system. You know, we're still dependent upon the earth out here for our well-being and for our food. It's sometimes easy to forget that, you know, when we look in the supermarkets today. But it's not just about our food system that we're talking about. Agriculture is a major contributor to global climate change. Agriculture, forestry, and land uses combined in the US contribute about 22% to global greenhouse gases. And if we're going to mitigate, or if we're going to cope with climate change, we have to have an agri-food system that has that ability to resist, recover, and to readjust to this new environment. When we go into our supermarkets today and we see this abundance of variety of food, we sometimes forget, or it's hard for us to be reminded and to remember that we're still interconnected with those farmers that produce the food and with those farms that that food comes from. And we have even less of an understanding of the ultimate dependence upon those farms and farmers to produce food is dependent upon the things of nature. It's dependent upon the air, the water, the soil, the microorganisms in the soil, the plants and the animals, and those things all functioning together so that we can transform solar energy into food energy. And that depends not only on the natural systems, but also the farmers and the farm workers and the communities in which these people function. And so we need to recognize that if we fail to adjust to climate change, we're confronted with an ecological, social, and economic collapse. We absolutely must, it's not a matter of option, we absolutely must create sustainable, regenerative, resilient systems of agriculture and food production. It's important to understand, I think, what a lot of people would doubt, but our current agri-food system is lacking in resilience. It's lacking in that resistance, recovery, and readjustment ability. It lacks the capacity to survive a volatile change in our climate, the weather volatility and the fundamental change. If you want to look at the characteristics that are most prominent in resilient systems, it's diversity. It's the diversity of those combination of different systems, but when we're talking about resilience and diversity, it's not just a collection of different components or different parts of different systems. Those components have to have particular characteristics. The components have to be different in their vulnerability to whatever the threat is that we're confronted in that time, so that we have a damage to one part of the system, it doesn't destroy or fatally injure the system as a whole. And it has to have the ability to recover in those times when we can't resist. It has to have redundancy sort of built in. It has to have the capacity within reserves to come in and supplement and build back. And then when we have fundamental changes like with climate change, it has to have the ability to readjust, to evolve and to change to meet the new challenges. What makes diverse systems resilient is the mutually beneficial relationships among those diverse individualistic parts of it. Also, in addition to resilience, if we're going to sustain our food system in the future, it has to be regenerative. And there's another set of R's that we're dealing with. It has to be able to renew and replenish and restore the productivity that's inevitably depleted in the process of production. The process of production inevitably kind of changes the productivity. If you go at the fundamental level, it's using energy and depletes the usefulness of that energy, and it has to be restored. And it's not just restoring the energy in the natural ecosystem using solar energy, but we have to sustain the farmers and the farm families and the farm workers and the communities that support that current system. The current system that we have today is built for efficiency, maximum production efficiency, but not regenerative capacity and not resilience. Our current, what I call industrial food system, has none of the characteristics for either resilience or regenerative capacity. It's a highly specialized system, not a diverse system. It's standardized. It works like a factory, an assembly line. It's not like independent people accommodating what nature can do in their particular place. And it's not mutually beneficial relationships. It's large hierarchical controlled systems. It's not regenerative. It depends upon fossil energy rather than renewable energy. It depends upon fertilizers to replenish the soil fertility instead of the natural biological activity of the soil capturing energy from the sun and restoring the fertility. It's not regenerative. It's not resilient. When we look at the threat of climate change, it just simply adds to the urgency of fundamentally changing the system. You don't have to take my word for it. Was a report came out in 2016, more than a dozen academic and other experts in sustainability from around the globe put together a study, and they reviewed and cited more than 350 different data sources and scientific studies to support their conclusions, and they called the evidence overwhelming. And I'm going to read from this so that you don't think I'm exaggerating when you hear their conclusions. They say that today's food and farming systems have succeeded in supplying large volumes of food to global markets, but they've generated negative outcomes on multiple fronts. There's widespread degradation of land, water, and ecosystems, high greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, persistent hunger, and micronutrient deficiency, alongside a rapid rise in obesity and diet-related diseases and livelihood stresses for farmers around the world. And what they concluded in their conclusion, they says, what is required is a fundamentally different model of agriculture based on diversifying farm and farming landscapes, replacing chemical inputs, optimizing biodiversity, and stimulating interaction between different species as part of a holistic strategy to build long-term soil productivity or fertility, healthy agroecosystems, and secure livelihoods. They go on to say that the data shows that these systems can compete with industrial agriculture in terms of total output, performing particularly strong under environmental stresses and delivering production increases in places of the world where additional food is desperately needed. Diversified agroecosystems can also pave the way for diverse diets and improved health. The leader of the organization, the leader of this panel, in commenting on the conclusions of the study, he said, it's not a lack of evidence holding back the agroecological alternatives. The way the food system is currently structured has allowed structured allows value to accrue to a limited number of actors, reinforcing their economic and political power, and thus their ability to influence governance of food systems. The good news is that we can change the governance of food system. We can change farm policies. We can change from the current farm policies that basically allow this industrial system to continue to exist by absorbing the economic risk and the economic cost of its lack of resilience through subsidized insurance programs, for crop insurance programs that not only ensure the yields of crops against adverse weather conditions, but also ensure the prices against adverse market swings that result from that. And in situations where the insurance is not sufficient, then we have disaster payments, such as we go out in the COVID crisis this year. And that came on top of a disruption in export markets. We've had an appropriation or authorization this year of $50 billion in farm programs over and above the cost of insurance and the ongoing programs. That's about $50,000 per commercial farm that's out here today. And by and large, this has gone to the large specialized farming operations. This is a result of our current farm and food, or farm policies in this case, but the food policies do the same thing. We can change those policies. The threat of climate change gives us an opportunity through the incentive and the insistence that we have to change. We have the technology of something to change to. We can change to science-based, farmer-tested alternatives, such as I've talked about in the global report. We see the framework in the Green New Deal. It's not only about how we restructure society, the economy overall, and the fossil fuel and the things that we talk about. It provides a framework for fundamental changes in farm policy. I work with an organization called Data for Progress that put together a farm policy proposal based on the Green New Deal. It's called the Green New Deal and Regenerative Agriculture. And I provided a link in the paper to the organizers here. The centerpiece of that is the transition of our current insurance programs from subsidizing commodity production on the large farm to subsidizing or absorbing the risk or sharing the risk of transitioning from industrial agriculture to regenerative, resilient, sustainable agricultural systems. And what the program would do, instead of focusing on commodities, it would ensure the farm income of those people, so that the income of the families, that new farmers and existing farmers that transition to regenerative, resilient, sustainable systems would be assured of an income on par with non-family farm income during that transition year. It could be in the form of a tax credit. But I'm just saying that there's proposals out here. You know, this change isn't going to be quick and easy. There's a lot of money invested in maintaining the industrial agriculture status quo today. It may ultimately take a consumer and taxpayer revolt, but if that's what it takes, that's what we can do. We, the people, still have the power to change. We have a new farm bill that's coming up where we'd have an opportunity to change these. It's a 2023 farm bill, but as soon as there's the new administration, regardless of what policies in Washington, the discussions will begin. And everyone has a stake in that, whether you're farmers or consumers, whether you're rural or urban, everyone has a stake in the farm policies that we need to put in place to address the threat of climate change. I would argue that everyone has a responsibility to become involved. There are dozens of advocacy organizations out here on sustainability. And again, I give a list of those in the paper that we have out here today. Find one that fits what you want to do, get involved with them. They'll keep you up to date on the important policies that are evolving. We must all be involved in planning for a more resilient future. Thank you.
All right, excellent, John. Thank you for contextualizing the challenges we face in the agricultural food sector. Up next, I'd like to introduce Santina Contreras. She's an assistant professor in the City and Regional Planning section of the Knowlton School of Architecture at Ohio State University. At Ohio State, she serves as a faculty affiliate of the Sustainability Institute and the Center for Latin American Studies. The overarching goal of her research and teaching is to contribute to a deeper understanding of the planning of communities vulnerable to environmental hazards and broader development concerns. Within this broader theme, she takes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding relationships between local communities and external stakeholders surrounding natural hazard events and built environment projects. Santina holds a bachelor's from the University of California, San Diego, a master's from the University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in planning and policy and design from the University of California, Irvine. Santina, take it away.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all the organizers and my fellow panelists. I'm happy to get a chance to contribute to this really critical conversation around planning for resilience. As Dan mentioned, a lot of the work that I do really centers on exploring equity and engagement concerns in environmental and hazards planning. And so what I was hoping to do today was to really take some time to build off of the really great points that Barbara and John already sort of laid out in terms of what we're sort of looking at in terms of the big problems facing us, and talk a little bit more about the specific role that community engagement can play in the resilience building process. And so to sort of set the stage for why this is important, to try to convince everyone that, to believe sort of as strongly as I do that this is sort of, one of the key things that we have to really be thinking about in this space, is that we know and we have these really great examples of the ways that resilience building efforts are really initiated by organizations, lots of local governments, any sort of big institution, lots of different entities are sort of involved in this space, sort of again connected to some of the projects that we've heard about today. And these efforts really play a very, very critical role in terms of addressing all of these climate hazards that communities face worldwide. But just as we know that, we also know that these past experiences has shown us that there can be a lot of potential issues that arise when parties that are very disconnected from the communities initiate and drive these resilience building efforts. And so things like the external entities not really adequately addressing the local needs and interests, right, due to maybe funding requirements, or even sort of what that means in terms of once projects are done and communities becoming overly dependent on these outside interventions. And so what that means for their ability to sustain and maintain the longevity of whatever sort of resilient building activity that we've started. And so because of all of these things, and sort of try to deal with them in a deeper way, it becomes really important to prioritize participation, engagement of local communities in resilience building activities. And so since I know what we're interested in here is really thinking about some actionable approaches that we can take to tackle these really big climate and resilience issues, I thought it might be helpful to walk through some of the examples of projects that I've been engaged in that highlight some of these different ways that we can really incorporate community engagement into our resilience building efforts. And so the first project I wanted to talk about a little bit about is a research collaboration that I'm a part of that's focused on flood hazard risks. And so as Dan mentioned in my bio, I'm from the California area. And so I hope that doesn't discourage anyone from seeing the overlap and connection because it focuses on flooding, which as we know is a really big issue in the Midwest as well. And so the Flood Resilient Infrastructure and Sustainable Environment, or the Flood Rise project as we call it, was an interdisciplinary project that was basically made up of a group of engineers, social scientists funded by the National Science Foundation, and is really focused on developing flood hazard simulations, and more broadly to really help communities become less vulnerable to flood hazards. And so the project team worked with stakeholders in 2 different communities, one in a Newport Bay estuary area, which is in the Southern California region, and then a Tijuana River estuary, which surrounds the US-Mexico border. And so the project itself was really focused on co-developing sets of flood hazard visualizations and decision-making recommendations that would be responsive of the needs and feedback of the impacted communities. And so there's obviously, and this is sort of why I think this is a good example, there's a lot of work being done in terms of thinking about floods, particularly around flood modeling. But in this project, what we were really focused on is contributing to that work, but in a way where we would be able to work in people's understanding of their own flood risk, right? And so what does it mean in terms of what people are experiencing about flooding, and then using that to improve the flood modeling process and to help the communities become less vulnerable to the hazard. And so this was done through what we describe as a collaborative flood modeling approach, which is a 4-stage process. And all of it sort of really focuses on coordinated end user interaction. And so that's part of sort of in the sort of fundamental parts of the project. And so what we really focus our work on is sort of these 4 phases that I've described here. But the things that I want us to sort of take away in terms of the ways that we can think about this for not just modeling projects, but in terms of what we're doing for resilience building more broadly, I think apply. And so, we start with sort of your traditional sort of flood modeling development. And this often is done, led by our engineers, thinking about that in terms of their expertise in that space. But throughout the process, this is sort of where we're incorporating our household level survey, our focus groups with local stakeholders, and so particular groups of community and local governments that can sort of speak to what those hazards look like on the ground. And then thinking about what that means in terms of training and outreach to those communities that are being impacted. And so the reason why you see in this image is sort of, connected sort of coloring scheme is because all of these things aren't happening completely in silo, right? Once we're getting survey data or interview data, focus group data from our communities, that's kind of feeding back into the model itself and into the larger decision making that we're doing. And so that's sort of the idea of keeping this together throughout the entire process. And so to talk about, to sort of think about the ways that this can be important in a specific example, I sort of wanted to highlight what this means in terms of once we actually put this back into the model. And so you know, a lot of times with community engagement, the thing that we focus on, which, you know, rightly so is really important, is to think about the ways that it can impact the local communities, right? This can be really great for empowerment and sort of thinking about what that means in terms of knowledge exchanges. But for sort of the topics that we're centered on, you know, I think it's also really important to sort of take away the ways that this actually can be really beneficial to the work of the scientists are doing themselves, right? And so what this means for the outputs that oftentimes we're very focused on. And so I think this sort of shows a good example of this, which is that, you know, we had sort of, and this sort of looks at our Tijuana River site. And so in this case, what we saw was that, you know, our engineers had developed a model based on all of the tools that we have at hand. Now, after sort of pulling this in together with our household survey, our focus group work, residents started recalling a lot of different events in terms of high flooding due to blockages of the culverts, specifically around large debris. So we would have a lot of stories of different sorts of the ways that runoff sort of occurs in those communities, what that meant for the ways that that was actually impacting the flood area. And so our original sort of iterations of this showed really minimal damages or sort of what flooding would look like because of these things. And so based on the resident experience that we were able to gather from the survey, our modelers were able to sort of develop new flood scenarios that we called our blockage scenarios, right? That really sort of focused on the ways that we can have these other sorts of issues. And these are sorts of things that wouldn't have been pursued if it hadn't have come about from the data that came from the community. So that's sort of an example of how that can kind of play together. The other thing that I sort of wanted to highlight was the ways that just even thinking about individuals' perceptions of risk can contribute in a lot of important ways to the process. And so another thing that we focused on in the project was integrating resident digital sketch maps to assess spatial knowledge of flood risk. And so what you see in these images, and so in the first one, you know, part of, again, what we were doing is thinking about where flood risks are sort of occurring, right? So our engineering teams are modeling based on their assessments, what FEMA sort of says about where flooding is occurring. And then in the second image, what you see is a copy of sort of a survey mapping exercise that we undertook with households living in the study area. And so we went out with iPads, we had them draw where they live and sort of where they witness flooding and where they think they might be more at risk based on flooding. And then with the data collected, we sort of overlaid all of this, and the participant sketches of areas were sort of put together. And so we were able to see where people really perceive their risk to be, and then classify portions of the study area based on percentages of where different sorts of feelings panned out. And so this obviously goes into more depth in terms of like numerics in the actual paper, but I just really wanted to sort of look at the bigger picture things, which I think is more important for our conversation. And so, you know, we see things like participant sketches were sort of more in alignment in certain areas versus other. But I think the most important takeaway that I just sort of found to be sort of the most interesting, fun, I'm not sure the right way to describe it, but is that, you know, none of the participants sort of imaging and sort of their perception of the flooding aligned very well with either what our flood modelers had put together or what FEMA sort of proposes in terms of where the flooding can occur. And so this, you know, this points to some potential gaps in what we're doing, right? And so whether this means that there are some issues in terms of where we're showing flooding could occur, that's, you know, maybe one take on it. The other side is also thinking more about the ways that, you know, maybe our models are very correct and there's nothing wrong with them, but in terms of where individuals are actually worried, and in terms of going sort of further than worried, what that means in terms of the sort of actions that they're taking to be prepared for them. So thinking about the ways that we have to sort of be mindful of not only the science behind this, but the ways that it is actually playing out with the communities that we're working with becomes really important. Because if we really want to think deeply about how we can build resilience and sort of make that happen, you know, this sort of is the tying point in terms of actually turning things into action. And so that's why I think it's really important to think about. And so the last thing I wanted to briefly touch on, because I know we're, you know, more interested in seeing how all this type of work can potentially be applied in the Midwest specifically, is a project that I'm currently a part of. And so this is just getting started. And so there's not as much to talk about in terms of results, but I just sort of wanted to present what this might look like in terms of these sort of collaborative community arrangements around resilience building activities. And so this project is what we call the Appalachian Water Research Exchange. And the goal of this project is to serve as sort of a collaborative effort with local partners and experts to understand and address water system issues and work towards developing equitable and sustainable water system in the Appalachian region. And so this project is another kind of example of these interdisciplinary teams. And so it's made up of engineers, social scientists, also some really great folklorists and Appalachian studies scholars here at Ohio State. And so I think the really cool thing about this project, though, is that we've paired up with some really, really great community organizations that have been working in the Appalachian area. And so in the Kentucky region, we're working with Lichen, the Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange, as well as groups in Appalachian, Ohio, through the Ohio Field School in Scioto and Perry counties. And so just to sort of give an idea of, again, what we're sort of thinking about in terms of the actionable things that we're trying to take from these interactions and sort of work with community partners on, is that we're really building off of these existing relationships these community organizations have done a lot of great work to develop, and then using that to conduct community-led concept mapping workshops to identify water quality issues that these communities are facing in this Appalachian region. And so this community engaged research is going to be used to conceptualize and quantify systems level understandings of the causal relationships between environmental, engineering, social, economic, political factors, and the consumer water systems and water districts. And so we're sort of thinking about all of these different ways that these things sort of impact each other. And so we want to think through what that means in terms of the stakeholders that are actually involved in the process. And so one of our really big aims is to really think through the ways that the larger historical processes have impacted the ability for these communities to actually get access to affordable water and what their perceptions in terms of what's impacting that from being well established in the future. And then also to work collaboratively to sort of create these sustainable and resilient systems that not only we can sort of, present sort of options for how this can be carried out in the future, but so to sort of let the communities take a firsthand role in sort of what would work for them in the best way to actually stay connected to this work and keep it going long after the project sort of completes. And so I kind of wanted to just sort of throw those projects out there to sort of give these sort of different sort of scaled and different sort of types of resilience building activities as examples to really frame what I think is sort of the most important takeaway that I wanted to contribute to this conversation is just sort of really the importance of having to sort of do these sorts of things and go this sort of additional effort to engage communities in this resilience planning space and the activities that we engage in. I would say that there are a lot of different reasons, again, why we should do this, but there's a few key things that I just sort of wanted to, let us sort of summarize, because I think they were well highlighted in the examples that I presented. The first thing that I just always sort of start with is that, it, for a lot of reasons, not just again for what the benefits it brings to the community, but just in terms of what that means towards bringing a diverse set of parties to the table in terms of using their expertise to address complex problems more broadly. And so I don't think we have more complex of a problem than trying to address climate and resilience questions. And so we know it's a big question. We all have lots of things that we bring to the table. And so thinking about the ways that we can engage communities really sort of opens up this conversation of bringing these different parties to the table. The other part is that, again, we really depend really heavily on what this is going to mean. All we talk about pretty much is sort of the long-termness of this and sort of needing this to be a future-based solution. So in that way, working with local partners really is one of the things that can strengthen this in the deepest way. And part of that includes what that does for their ability to sort of maintain their livelihoods. And so things like providing funding, employment opportunities, all of those things are sometimes missing from the conversation of resilience. We feel like that's maybe not the main priority in terms of what we're thinking about the science, but our ability to sort of make sure those projects happen and that they meet the needs of the communities actually means that we have to think about this more broadly. And so those are some of the things that can kind of come about by starting engagement in an early phase. And then it also just sort of, I think just, like the biggest takeaway that I think in the end for me is just that it really, in a lot of ways, can enhance just the relevance of the project itself, right? And so if we really want these things to be things that we can use and people can use, what better way than to sort of think about what they need, asking them, and then we'll often be surprised based on some of the things that I showed using flooding as an example, a lot of knowledge that is sort of inherent to the local communities that sort of can inform the work that we're doing in a much deeper way. And so with that, I'll thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions when we get to the Q&A.
All right, great. Thank you, Santina, for that perspective on community involvement in climate action strategies. And so I wanted to take a moment to just encourage everyone that if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'd love to ask your questions. Some in the conversation that we're about to have. So in the spirit of climate action, I wanted to ask the first question to both Barbara and John, and it has to do with priorities. Barbara, you talked about some demonstration projects, and so you've actually got some boots on the ground, and you've seen things happen. And I wanted to ask you, based on that experience, what would you suggest prioritizing in the short term? What could we do right away in the communities you've already worked in, but perhaps also other places in the Midwest? What's scalable? And John, you talked from a somewhat theoretical perspective about building diversity into our agricultural sector. And I was curious if you might be able to speak to some demonstration projects that show diversity and talk us through the priorities that might exist there. So Barbara, would you like to start?
Sure, thanks, Daniel. So in terms of priorities and scalability, I think a couple of the things that really communities need to focus on is to enable them to access funding for doing these different types of projects. And there is a great deal of funding out there, but accessing it can be tricky. One of the key things is for communities to have active hazard mitigation plans that incorporate some of these nature-based solutions. Your state and your local jurisdiction needs to have those plans, and they need to be included in there to access funding from programs like FEMA's new pre-disaster mitigation, their BRIC program, building resilient infrastructure in communities. So that's just one, sort of tangible action that you can be involved in your community, making sure that those actions are in that plan so that those funding sources can be utilized. That would be kind of one of the key things I would say. And then working with, programs like the Silver Jackets with the Army Corps, making sure, is a flood management plan something that your community would benefit from? Looking at where other disaster funding comes from through the NRCS programs, has disaster, one of the big funding tools for the levee setback was using disaster resilience funding for floodplain easements. And so there are a number of programs, and making sure that you know what they are and getting access, and that they are being robustly funded to help landowners and help communities implement projects.
All right, great. And John?
Yes, to begin with, I saw in the chat area over here talking about the report. If you Google data for progress and then regenerative agriculture and the Green New Deal, it'll take you to that report that I was talking about. Regenerative agriculture, the Green New Deal, data for progress. Just Google that, it'll bring up the report. I also provide the link in the paper that I provided. When you talk about demonstration projects around, every university now practically has some sort of program in sustainability, and the agricultural colleges will have some sort of program there as well. And some of those will have demonstration projects and research projects that relate to diversity. I think the Bradford Farm outside the University of Missouri, somewhere this side of Columbia, or between Columbia and St. Louis, and then the Leopold Center at Iowa State University, they're carrying out long-term trials on crop rotations and things of that nature. But the best examples are the farmers that are actually doing this. The whole early organic farming movement was about what I was talking about here. It's diversified farming operations where the farmer, what's going on in the soil, the plants, the animals, all part of an integrated systems. And those systems are inherently diverse, relying on crop rotations, integration of crop and livestock systems so that they come together to regenerate the soil productivity and so on. And you can find, you go to a local farmer's market or look for opportunities for CSAs. Most areas will have a directory of people that supply local foods. And by and large, those people that are supplying local markets, whether it's farmers markets or CSAs, are increasingly online with the COVID pandemic. Those are farmers that have diversified farming operations, whether they're focusing on fruits and vegetables or things of this nature. Many of them will have livestock operations where they're rebuilding soil at the same time they're doing other things. So this movement toward regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, resilient agriculture has been going on since the start of the organic movement, but particularly since the late 1980s when I became involved in it. And it's continued to evolve through the years. There's holistic resource management, there's permaculture, there's biodynamic farming, there's ecological farming. Acres USA promotes ecological farming. There's a whole range of those that all reflect the kind of the principles I was talking about. And agroecology is kind of the scientific foundation for all of that. And it applies ecology to agriculture, and the idea that was brought up in the keynote speaker that everything is interrelated. And some of Santina was talking about, you know, the people are part of the system. We're all an integral part of this, and the farmer and the farm are part of that farming system. But I'll stop right there. But there's, you know, the best examples of people that are actually doing it, and you can eat the food that comes from their farms.
Great, thanks, John. Next question here is for Santina, and I was curious from a stakeholder perspective. Very often solutions come from on high, and there's got to be some tension there between, you know, top-down solutions versus what the actual stakeholders want. And I know you talked a lot about the benefits of involving the community in coming up with solutions, but can you talk a little bit about the challenges that are involved?
Yeah, thanks. And so that's a really great question. So I think that, you know, we'd be remiss to sort of not think about this in this full pictured way. And so definitely thinking about the challenges is a huge part of this, because the biggest, I think I can say in terms of thinking about this in an actionable sense is, you know, if we're already talking about very complex systems, which, you know, John really well put in his last statement as well. This adds a whole other dimension of complexity, right? Because now we're not only thinking about the complexity of the science and sort of finding those solutions that we need. Now we're actually talking about all of the complexities that kind of come at that social level in terms of the dynamics of what a community is going to enter in. And so I think that is, you know, probably the best place to start in terms of the awareness of the fact that oftentimes this maybe is not done at all, or done to the extent that we want it to be done, particularly because of the fact that it becomes very difficult. With that being said, I still think it's worth going through you know, the effort, because it's sort of, it's of that much criticalness. I would say a few spaces that we often have to sort of think very deeply about are things in terms of what sort of ways we can sort of interject in a way that can try to sort of minimize the ways that these things can be larger issues and sort of explode in the end. And so oftentimes the ways that we initiate our community engagement, for example, is a big part of this, right? And so there's a tendency from you know, I won't pick on any sort of discipline specifically, but we may sort of come into a community after we sort of already have come up with our solution. You know, I guess I can start with engineers. I used to be an engineer myself, and so I know that I am a victim to this. But you know, it can be difficult to sort of you know, you have a very set way in terms of how you think that this problem should be approached, and so the way that we might see our engagement is sort of coming to a community with something that we've already established, some sort of, whether it's a project, whether it's some sort of action-based thing that we want to happen. And so, you know, that's kind of, I guess, maybe the first place to start in terms of, you know, how we approach what that engagement looks like, I think can go a long way in terms of minimizing some of those complexities. And so if you get that buy-in early on, ideally, if you're sort of working, as I mentioned in the second example in the Appalachian project, you know, we're sort of starting that project with community organizations that have already been very ingrained in that community. And so even though that project is also with engineers that have lots of new projects that they want to sort of, you know, things that they want to test out, there's already some ideas there. Nothing is sort of happening without sort of the buy-in of the community originally, and particularly with people that have that voice and connection to be able to sort of work closely to sort of get a sense of what works the best for them, and sort of how we can incorporate our project in a way that's going to make sense and sort of minimize those conflicts and challenges later on throughout the phase of the project.
Yeah, and I thought I'd bring up the fact that at the federal level, they're actually taking this quite seriously. We just, at the National Science Foundation, just put out a call not too long ago for what are called civic proposals. And these are proposals that actually come from the community, the stakeholders, and they partner with university scientists to try to build solutions in communities. There's a question in here that's kind of practical. It's directed towards Santina, but I think everybody on the panel might might be able to weigh in. And that's, how do you find or select local organizations to partner with? And is there anything specific that you're looking for when partnering to do the sort of research that you're interested in, either from the community perspective or from the theoretical perspective?
Yeah, so I guess I can start. That's again another really critical point in terms of sort of like thinking about this longer term vision of what projects look like. You know, a lot of the work that I've engaged in the past, you know, I think this can kind of go different ways, but I sort of approach this as sort of like this open call, sort of the more the merrier in some ways. And so in some ways thinking through, you know, what are the goals that you're trying to achieve? What are who has that history, who sort of has that pulse that sort of connects in the best possible way. And so what I often talk about around when I'm thinking about community organizations is even the sort of idea of community is a really broad idea, right? And so we oftentimes just sort of talk about one area and one region and just say community. And within that, there's lots of different sort of aspects. And so I think my best recommendation is usually the way that I go about this in projects is sort of trying to think as specifically as possible about who you're trying to impact or who is going to be impacted potentially the most by the project, and are those voices, you know, kind of best represented or best sort of part of the process for what you're going to be doing, you know. And so if there's ways to make those linkages, that's great. On the other end, I'm in a lot of projects where you know, you're just lucky if you can find access or sort of who can sort of be able to sort of work together. And so I think that's sort of the spectrum of it, is that, you know, you might have situations where you're picking apart between different sort of organizations or different sorts of groups to work with. And other times, you know, there might be minimal and you're sort of building those connections, you know, fresh completely. And so I would say that I think both are sort of work, or that's sort of all that you have to deal with. But I think that those are the different sort of approaches I take in those different situations.
I'll suggest, you know, in the area of agriculture, it really depends on what area you're interested in. I'm a big believer in kind of following your intuition, follow your bliss, if you will. What is it that you want to do? What do you feel passionate about? What do you want to get involved in? And then once you've determined that, I think, I'm not a big technology person, but I think the internet is the easiest way to find organizations that are involved in the kind of things that you're interested in doing once you've made that first step. So if you're interested in getting involved in agricultural policy, for example, like I've talked about here, then you can go online and you can say, okay, sustainable agriculture advocacy organizations, this is what I did. And you'll come up with a whole big list of them. And you can see how many of those maybe that are functioning in your area. If you're interested in a local foods issue, you can find all kinds of people that are doing that on the internet, or read the local newspapers. If there's an article that comes up, you know, that strikes your interest and there's a local group involved in it, then you can contact that group and you can go ask somebody in that particular organization. But I really believe that each one of us has a particular and a unique role to play in these issues that we're confronted with today. And the important thing is to find, like when I kind of lost my voice, but to find what it is that kind of brings you into this movement. What is it that inspires you to get involved in climate change? Like here in Fairfield, Iowa, where I live now, we've got a very active local group that's dealing with climate change issues, a wide range of it. And if you wanted to get involved in other aspects of environmental issues, I could probably find here in Fairfield, Iowa, I could probably find a local group. I go online and look and watch the newspaper. I could find an organization to put you in contact with that would occupy your full amount of time you're willing to commit to it. I don't think there's a real problem in finding some place to connect once you decide that you're willing to put the time and energy into being involved with it.
I would just add, you know, from the perspective of the Nature Conservancy, working with local communities, and we do this, you know, throughout the whole country on different projects. And I'll maybe use the Levee project as an example. And of course, this varies, you know, from place to place. But I think some of the key components are, you know, obviously, you know, does it line up with our mission and what skills and goals we're trying to accomplish through our mission and vision. And then a passionate community. You know, in the Levee project, this is a community-driven project, and though there are lots of state and federal agencies and the Nature Conservancy involved in providing a lot of funding and technical support, but it's the passion of the community and the community leaders and their vision that drive and make this an incredible project. And so that's a key ingredient. And then is it have the potential to be transformational? Is it a demonstration project that others can learn from throughout the region, throughout the nation? What are we learning from the project? How are we changing policies, practices, information, funding sources? Are we able to tell stories so that other communities can take that information and take components of it that they might want to apply in their community? You know, those are kind of the ingredients that help us decide, you know, where we can invest and be of the biggest help and the biggest benefit to the community and to the resource outcomes that we're all driving for.
All right, thank you. I believe we started a little late, so I'm going to ask one more question. But I asked the panelists to respond to it relatively quickly before we wrap up. And that has something specific to do with just the summit. And I wanted to know if you think there's an opportunity for the organizations that are collaborating on the summit to develop a new tool that supports local planning or expand the geographic scope of an existing tool. For example, creating a centralized climate map for the region. Would this be useful? Do you think the collective brain power of the people participating in the summit could advance climate action in some form, in some concrete form, in the future?
I don't think I know enough to respond intelligently to that, but I think, you know, it's always helpful when you've got good information or more information than you had before, even in like in agricultural areas, knowing which direction the wind is blowing and knowing where the watersheds are and how they're defined and what stream leads into what stream and things of that nature. That's always useful information. And I think the important thing is if you've got somebody that's really interested in pursuing that their enthusiasm will probably attract people that will lead to something that would be useful as a consequence.
I guess I can just add and say, to speak to the community engagement piece, I am a fan of metrics, anything to sort of push that conversation towards something more measurable. And so I think, you know, my vote, if we were sort of to come up with a toolkit such as this, would be, you know, finding ways to sort of incorporate that, what that looks like in terms of either, you know, community needs or what, you know, whatever level we're talking about, what that means in terms of meeting those goals at a community level. I could see that being of use, because I do think that some of these toolkits or some sort of measurement help sort of push the boundaries to sort of make sure that's incorporated. So I would say if for that reason, in that space, I would think I could sort of imagine what the use in that.
I'm with John. I don't know that I have enough information to answer intelligently. You know, and I agree with Santina. You know, I mean, tools are helpful, and I know there's a broad suite of different kinds of tools that are useful in different contexts. And I mean, this is an incredible powerhouse of people and organizations. So I think it's certainly worth investigating further.
All right. Well, I'd like to take the time to thank our panelists for a great discussion, and also thank all the folks that attended and listened to us today. And I haven't checked the internet lately, so I don't know if anything momentous has occurred, but I hope today's a historic day, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.